Imagine sailing 18,000 miles across the entire globe, knowing every knot closer is a knot towards certain death. This is the tragic tale of the Russian Baltic Fleet. 40 obsolete warships, crewed by broken men, sent on a voyage no navy had ever attempted. Their destination was a trap. Their opponent was a silent genius who had already perfected the geometry of annihilation. The war with Japan had been a disaster from the first day. 9 months before the Baltic Fleet ever weighed anchor, the Russian Empire had lost its entire strategic position in the Far East. The Japanese had launched a devastating, surprise night attack on the Russian fleet anchored at Port Arthur, and the subsequent siege had been a relentless, slow-motion destruction. The city was a ruin, and the vast majority of Russia's primary Pacific squadron lay scuttled or sunk beneath the harbor waters. By the close of 1903, the pride of the Russian Far East Navy had been obliterated, sunken, or captured. Russia was, for the first time in centuries, a great power without a viable fleet on the world's most critical ocean. The shockwave that hit St. Petersburg was profound. The imperial court, headed by Tsar Nicholas II, was paralyzed by a mixture of hubris and denial. They could not, would not, accept the humiliating defeat by an opponent they still condescendingly referred to as little yellow monkeys. To lose was acceptable. To lose to Japan was an existential insult. The desperate, almost insane solution arrived directly from the Admiralty. Send the only available force left. Strip the ships of the Baltic Fleet, the ancient, forgotten vessels and training cruisers, and send them around the entire globe, 12,000 nautical miles, to retake control of the Pacific. This was an act of political necessity, dressed up as military strategy. The men selected to lead this odyssey of despair knew the truth. Chief among them was Vice Admiral Zinovy Petrovich Rozhestvensky, a pragmatic veteran of the Black Sea Wars, and a man under no illusions, given an impossible mission. His assignment was a nightmare wrapped in a uniform. His fleet was a heterogeneous mess of rust and mismatched firepower. He had a few newly built flagships, powerful but untested, rushed out of the yards, barely painted and not properly shaken down. But these modern ships were backed up by a collection of rusty, barely floating relics built decades earlier, vessels so slow and poorly maintained that they were notoriously nicknamed floating wash stands by the press. These ships suffered from chronic boiler issues, leaky hulls, and were dangerously top-heavy due to hastily added coal bunkers and armor. Worse still, their crews were mostly raw conscripts, pulled straight from farming villages or factories, given minimal training and no time to drill together as a cohesive unit. They lacked the discipline and, crucially, the gunnery experience of the long-serving Japanese crews. Rozhestvensky, known for his caustic temper, surveyed his charge and knew he was leading these men to certain slaughter. The Tsar, however, had one final, impossible order. The honor of the Tsar and the dignity of the Empire demanded the attempt. As the cold Baltic mist gave way to the open ocean, the desperate hope was that somehow sheer brute Russian tonnage could intimidate the Japanese, or at least force a favorable peace. They were packed with every possible piece of equipment, spare parts, ammunition, and enough coal to reach their target. But the ships themselves, laden with this immense weight, were already dangerously sluggish and unstable, straining against the burden of a dying imperial ambition. The sheer logistical demand had already compromised their fighting efficiency. They left Europe behind, steaming toward an endless horizon that held no promise of glory, only the mounting, grinding burden of a journey. No fleet in history had ever successfully completed. The men knew the stakes. It was not just a battle for the Pacific, but a desperate move for the survival of the entire imperial regime. The 2nd Pacific Squadron had begun its long, slow march toward a strategically perfect ambush, and the first mile was already the hardest. October 1904. The moment the ships cleared the English Channel, the mission transformed from a strategic maneuver into a sustained exercise in misery. For 7 months, the 2nd Pacific Squadron lumbered eastward, a slow-moving target on the face of the world. Every man, from the admiral down to the lowest stoker, was consumed by the relentless logistics of the journey itself. The primary enemy wasn't Japan, not yet. It was the coal. They needed immense amounts of fuel to cross the planet. Russia, lacking a network of coaling stations along the route, was forced to rely entirely on German-chartered colliers. The act of coaling at sea became the daily, humiliating ritual of the fleet. In the freezing North Atlantic, and later in the equatorial heat, thousands of tons of coal were manually hauled by the crews, basket by basket, from the tenders onto the already dangerously low decks of the battleships. The tropical sun beat down relentlessly near Madagascar. Men stripped to the waist, blackened by coal dust and sweat, collapsed from heat exhaustion. The decks became furnaces, and the lack of proper ventilation meant the lower decks where the men slept were almost unbearable infernos. The relentless labor and stifling heat broke the men's bodies and spirits months before they ever saw the enemy. The psychological toll was even worse. The further they sailed, the more detached they became from reality, and the paranoia set in. This fear erupted into a spectacular, embarrassing international crisis in the North Sea. Near the Dogger Bank, convinced they were being ambushed by Japanese torpedo boats, which logically could not have been there, the Russian crews opened fire on a British fishing fleet. In the confusion, they managed to sink one of their own vessels and kill 2 British fishermen. The Dogger Bank incident brought Britain, the world's supreme naval power, to the brink of war with Russia. Rozhdestvensky was forced to pause in Spain, while diplomats frantically worked to prevent the entire mission from being aborted by an international war. It was a perfect encapsulation of the fleet's state: high-strung, incompetent in battle drill, and paranoid beyond reason. The world saw a fleet in panic. But the reality was far worse. The enemy was no longer ships, but the very air the sailors breathed. The subsequent voyage through the African coast and into the stifling heat of the Indian Ocean only compounded the despair. The ships, unsuited for the tropics, were caked in salt and rust. The paint peeled off, exposing the yellow-brown corrosion underneath, making the entire armada look like a floating graveyard before the battle had even begun. Sickness, scurvy, and dysentery spread quickly among the malnourished crews, further eroding their capacity to fight. As the Russian sailors endured the endless, arduous work of shoveling coal and bailing water, their mental state deteriorated. They knew their mission was a folly. They knew they were sailing into a defeat that had already been guaranteed by the ship's age and the length of the journey. Their commander, Rozhdestvensky, sank into a depressive fury, forced to write increasingly frantic and hopeless telegrams back to the Tsar, which were inevitably dismissed. If you're finding this epic journey of courage and disaster compelling, hit the subscribe button now. We bring you the greatest stories of strategy and human endeavor every week. Also, take a moment to drop a comment and tell us which doomed mission in history you think was more insane than this one. By the time the fleet finally regrouped in the waters near French Indochina, it was physically and mentally broken. The men were ghosts of themselves, worn out by 8 months of relentless labor and fear. They were no longer an operational fleet. They were a collection of fatigued, floating targets. The entire globe had been crossed, every man pushed beyond endurance. Yet the final leg of the journey lay ahead, a dash across the last few hundred miles of the Pacific toward the inevitable final confrontation. While the Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron was consumed by the misery of the equator, a silent, disciplined machine awaited them. Admiral Togo Heihachiro, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, was the perfect counterpoint to the chaotic Russian command. He was the Nelson of the East, a reserved, patient, and ruthless tactician. Togo was not distracted by the Russians' odyssey. He viewed the entire process with professional calm, knowing that time and logistics were fighting on his side. Togo's strategy was simple, brilliant, and based on utter control. He had spent the months of the Russian approach carefully refitting his fleet. His ships, fast, well-armored, and equipped with the latest technology, were superior in almost every category. Crucially, they were equipped with a greater percentage of high-explosive Shimose shells, which detonated with a searing intensity, causing catastrophic fires and damage to the superstructure, unlike the Russians' older, mostly armor-piercing rounds. Even more decisive was the mastery of wireless telegraphy, a technology the Japanese had perfected and used constantly for intelligence, while the Russians possessed it only sporadically and used it inefficiently. This technological edge alone guaranteed a one-sided fight. More important than ordnance, however, was intelligence. Togo commanded a masterful network that was tracking every agonizing knot of Russian progress. Japanese intelligence knew the exact size, composition, speed, and likely course of their enemy, almost in real time. Togo's patience was not passive, it was tactical. He wanted the Russians to arrive at the battle exactly as they were, slow, exhausted, and weighed down with months of coal dust and tropical despair. Togo knew the Russians had only 2 viable options after they left Southeast Asia: the long, indirect route around the east of Japan, or the direct, shortest, and most fuel-efficient route through the Tsushima Strait, the narrow channel between Korea and Japan. As the Russian ships were burning coal at an unsustainable rate and were burdened by the need to protect their supply ships, Togo was certain they would choose the strait. It was the quickest way to Vladivostok, the only surviving, friendly port. Togo didn't need to chase them. He needed only to wait for them to enter the precise point where geometry, not firepower, would win the war. The Japanese admiral did not chase the Russians across the world. Instead, he waited, meticulously preparing his killing zone. He turned the Tsushima Strait into the perfect choke point, a perfectly laid ambush. The Japanese fleet was fresh, fully fueled, and rested. Togo's crews were constantly practicing gunnery drills, training to fire faster and more accurately than any other navy in the world. Their marksmanship was legendary, capable of landing 3 or 4 shots to the Russians' 1. The waiting was the hardest part, but Togo's professional patience was absolute. He understood that the 18,000-mile journey was doing more damage to the Russian fleet than any Japanese shell could. When the Russians finally arrived, they would be slow, exhausted, and desperately hoping for a non-existent miracle. As Rozhestvensky's ships steamed into the final approach, battered by rust and psychological despair, Togo's entire combined fleet lay silently waiting. On the morning of May 27th, 1905, the waiting ended. A Japanese scout ship spotted the straggling line of Russian warships. The radio crackled with the message Togo had waited 8 months to receive. Enemy fleet sighted in location 203. It is the Russian Baltic Fleet. The trap was sprung, and the perfect geometry of annihilation was now in motion. May 27th, 1905. The endless voyage was finally over. The skies were grey, the sea was choppy, and the visibility was poor. As the Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron, rusty, slow, and trailing thick, telltale black smoke from their overworked boilers, limped into the narrow Tsushima Strait, they were already spotted. The Japanese scouts relayed the coordinates of their prey with precise wireless communication. Admiral Rozhestvensky knew the moment of contact was imminent, but he had no idea the tactical precision he was about to face. The Japanese combined fleet appeared out of the gloom in a perfectly executed line-ahead formation. The Russian line, meanwhile, was ragged and disorganized, attempting to shepherd their various slow cruisers and supply ships through the strait. Rozhestvensky hoisted the signal for the fleet to prepare for battle, a last defiant act of a man staring down his destiny. Admiral Togo Heihachiro, observing the Russian approach, ordered the single most brilliant and decisive maneuver in the history of naval warfare, the crossing the T. To understand the disaster that followed, you must visualize the letter T. The Russian battleships were sailing in a long, predictable column, the vertical stroke of the T. The Japanese fleet, led by Togo's flagship Mikasa, executed a sharp, coordinated turn. In the heart of the battle, they sailed directly across the Russian column, the horizontal bar of the T. This maneuver achieved a devastating, simple geometrical advantage. The Russians, strung out in a line, could only fire their forward guns. But Togo's fleet, arrayed across their path, could bring every single gun, bow, stern, and broadside to bear on the leading Russian ships. It was a one-sided firing drill, a perfect, inescapable tactical slaughter. At approximately 1:45 post-meridian, the Japanese gunners unleashed hell. The opening salvos were immediate and overwhelming. The Japanese shells struck the Russian ships with terrifying accuracy. The advanced high-explosive Shimose shells tore through the Russian superstructures, detonating with white, hot fury. Unlike Constantinople's walls shattered by stone, these ships were devoured by fire and shrapnel, turning the Russian vessels into burning inferno within minutes. The older Russian armor, added hastily and often improperly, offered almost no resistance against this modern ordnance. The flagship of the Russian line, the battleship Knyaz Suvorov, was almost instantly destroyed. A direct hit severed the fire main, leaving the crew unable to fight the flames. Within minutes, its bridge was wrecked, its command structure decapitated, and its massive forward guns silenced. Admiral Rozhestvensky himself was seriously wounded, blown from the bridge, and incapacitated, his command collapsing around him. The tactical disaster compounded into total chaos. With their flagship blazing and their command crippled, the following Russian ships desperately attempted to take command, but Togo's geometry was inescapable. For the next hour and a half, the Japanese fleet continued to rain fire down the line of the Russian ships. The smoke was so thick, it was often impossible to see the Japanese line, but the incoming shells were constant. The Russians fought with ferocious, desperate courage, maintaining their positions even as the decks ran red and their ships buckled. But their antiquated gunnery, combined with the extreme fatigue of their crews, was no match for the Japanese speed and precision. The ships, heavy with coal and weakened by the long voyage, were burning, listing, and sinking within moments of engagement. The long, impossible journey had been merely the tragic prelude to an inevitable, crushing finale. We are nearing the end of this journey, but there are so many more incredible historical moments and tactical masterpieces to explore. Please share this video with another history fan. It helps us continue to produce these deep dive stories. The battle was not a single engagement. It was a liquidation that lasted 48 hours. The night of May 27th brought no respite. Japanese torpedo boats swarmed the crippled and straggling Russian fleet, delivering the final blows to ships already burning and defeated. The exhausted Russian sailors, many clinging to the remnants of their ships, faced a new kind of terror in the darkness of the open sea. The morning of May 28th revealed the horrifying scale of the annihilation. The 2nd Pacific Squadron, the fleet that had sailed 18,000 miles to save an empire, was gone. The statistics are staggering. The Russian Empire lost 21 out of 38 ships sunk, 7 more captured, and 6 interned in neutral ports. Only 3 light cruisers and 1 torpedo boat managed to limp into Vladivostok. Over 5,000 Russian sailors were killed, and 6,000 more were captured. Japan, by contrast, lost a mere 116 men and 3 small torpedo boats. This was not a victory. It was a perfect, one-sided military execution. It was the last time in history a major naval battle would be fought exclusively by battleships, proving the supremacy of modern technology and tactics. Admiral Rozhestvensky was pulled unconscious and gravely wounded from the wreckage of a destroyer. He survived, but his career and his faith in the empire were shattered. His capture was a final humiliation for the Tsar. The political shockwave that hit St. Petersburg was terminal. The defeat at Tsushima was the final devastating proof of the Tsar's incompetent regime. The Russian people had tolerated the previous military defeats, but the total loss of the nation's entire operational navy, after an agonizing public journey of 8 months, broke the national morale. Tsushima was not just a naval defeat, it was a key catalyst for the growing revolutionary fervor that culminated in the 1905 Russian Revolution. The defeat weakened the Tsar's position irreversibly, setting the clock ticking toward 1917. Globally, the impact was profound. Japan became the first non-Western power in the modern age to utterly destroy a major European power's military force. The entire world of naval doctrine was forced to change overnight. The era of the heavily armored, slow battleship was over, replaced by the demand for speed and advanced fire control. The long, grueling voyage of the 2nd Pacific Squadron was a tragic testament to the price of hubris and denial. The men were brave, the journey was epic, but the mission was impossible from the first day. They were sent not to fight a battle they could win, but to maintain a political facade that had already crumbled. The Battle of Tsushima stands as the clearest historical proof that when unyielding, disciplined preparation meets exhausted, dilapidated desperation, the outcome is never in doubt. This is the end of the doomed journey of the Baltic Fleet, but the beginning of a new chapter for global power. If you were captivated by the dramatic precision of Admiral Togo's strategy and the epic tragedy of the Russian sailors, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the battles that shaped our world. Let us know in the comments below what other forgotten high-stakes moment in history you want us to explore next.